Got a great show on tap for you today, but before we get into the latest Texans draft visits and NFL draft buzz next Wednesday, we have a special live show here on Texans Today, a pre-draft special live with guest Aaron Wilson, answering your questions around the Texans draft and giving you a complete breakdown before we get into the 2025 NFL draft. It will be next Wednesday, April 16th, 5 p.m. Central Time. So if you want to catch the show, if you want to ask Aaron or me any questions, make sure you tap in, subscribe, and hit those notification bells. On today's show, breaking down all the latest Texans draft visits you need to know about and the latest buzz around the 2025 NFL draft, because there are some very interesting storylines going on as we get closer and closer to the start of the 2025 NFL draft. Now, I want to know from you folks at home, and I love that producer Justin put this as the title, David Carr, is he the worst Texans draft pick of all time? Everybody here at the Chat Sports Studios was breaking down, this is my team's worst selection of all time. This is my team's worst pick. I said Kenyon Green was one of the worst ones. I was also between Kevin Johnson. David Carr, I don't know if I'd classify him as the worst Texans draft pick of all time, being that, he had a very rough go of it with the beginning of the Houston Texans. But let me know down in the comment section, what do you think is one of the worst Texans draft picks of all time? I'm going to be looking down below. I'm interested to see what y'all have to say. Now, speaking of the draft, let's talk about draft visits. First up, Kaleb Johnson visited with the Houston Texans, running back from Iowa, and a very interesting draft visit for the Houston Texans, because I talked about it on our show the other day, how they met with Quinshon Judkins, and could the Texans be looking at running back early on in the draft? Kaleb Johnson is in that same stratosphere as a Quinshon Judkins, as a maybe sneaky end of round one, going into round two, round three prospect. And a lot of Texans fans were thinking, we're not going to draft the running back until the mid to later rounds. The latest draft visits, it does look like the Texans are considering going with one of these top running backs in this class. And now Kaleb Johnson is fantastic, right? 240 carries this past year for Iowa, over 1,500 yards, 23 touchdowns totaling, and no fumbles this past year. I mean, the dude's an absolute beast. And, he doesn't he has some tread on his tires, right? This past year, obviously, was the lead back for Iowa, averaging more than 6 yards a carry, 21 touchdowns on the ground. I think he would be a dynamic running back next to Joe Mixon. I don't know if their running styles necessarily bounce off each other that much, because, Kaleb Johnson is a pretty good zone runner and, has some speed. He's a speedy back, but I don't know if the Texans are going to be able to give him that workhorse back or get the most out of him in his first 5 years if they're going to, take a running back in the first or second round, because they do have Joe Mixon, who is such of a bell cow back. The Texans have met with several running backs in this pre-draft process, and it's seeming more likely that they draft one in the first 3 rounds. It's getting up there, because guys like Brashard Smith, Jaden Blue, those guys are really good as well, and I feel like those guys are even moving up draft boards little by little. So it's seeming like if there's somebody on the board like a Kaleb Johnson, like a Quinshon Judkins in round 2, and they don't like any of the other wide receiver or tight end prospects, they could easily go running back in round 2 or round 3, which sounds crazy just coming out of my mouth right now. I don't think many Texans fans would think that the Texans would go running back early on, but these pre-draft visits indicate that being the case. Another one, which it's funny, I was actually talking with a couple of my sources close to the Houston Texans, and this was not really publicized. This wasn't a draft visit that a lot of people have been talking about or have reported on. But Kaleb Johnson actually had a video on his IG while visiting the Houston Texans in their locker room, and you know who was in the background of that photo? Gray Zabel, offensive lineman from North Dakota State. And that's pretty interesting because, like I said, not a lot of reporting on Gray Zabel visiting with the Houston Texans. I haven't seen any, big NFL media talking heads talking about it just yet. Very interesting, though, because the Texans, like I said, are going to be looking for an offensive lineman early in this draft, and I do wonder if maybe it's a guy like Zabel who they take a shot on in round 1. They're going to have to take him in round 1 if they want to take him in this year's draft, but he's the number 1 ranked center from most draft experts in this year's draft class, but also gives you that guard flexibility. He's also played tackle before at North Dakota State. But I know the Texans are going to be looking to draft offensive linemen, and they're definitely doing their due diligence. Somebody else who hasn't had a top 30 visit yet with the Houston Texans, and I've been getting a lot of questions on because I've been talking about him for weeks now as one of my guys, Donovan Jackson. He actually doesn't have to take a top 30 visit with the Houston Texans, and I'll tell you why. He can actually be a local visit. And I know you're like, Ohio State, how is he a local visit? The rules for local visits also extends to if you grew up in that city or if you're from that city. From Bel Air, went to Cyprus. So he classifies as somebody who can be a local visit for the Houston Texans, not a top 30 visit. So they don't have to necessarily report it. They don't have to go through the top 30 visit ramifications with a guy like Donovan Jackson. I do think they're doing their due diligence. I do still think Donovan Jackson is in to be one of the guys that the Texans could draft in round 1. But just for people who are like, why haven't we had a top 30 visit with Donovan Jackson yet? You don't necessarily have to with Mr. Jackson. And another draft visit that I want to break down, Mac McWilliams, maybe one of the best names in the NFL draft. Defensive back from UCF is a, middle round type of guy, standout, ran a 4.4 40, I believe at his pro day, a speedster from UCF this past year, 32 tackles, 1 interception, 2 pass breakups. We've seen the Texans, besides Siobhan Revel Jr., a lot of defensive backs later on in the NFL draft, probably going to look to add somebody in the secondary in round, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on, how many picks the Texans have. I expect Nick Scourton to trade back or trade up multiple times in this draft, so who knows where the Texans will end up selecting come draft day. But Mac McWilliams, another guy the Texans have a draft visit with, and this actually came in right before we started filming this video from Aaron Wilson, my guy. Remember, tune in next Wednesday for our live show, our pre-draft live special. Michigan State Spartan center guard Luke Niemann visits the Houston Texans per a source. A Holy Cross transfer. Niemann was honorable mention all Big Ten. So another offensive lineman, this time a guy in Luke Niemann, who is another middle round guy, around like 3, 4, 5, 6 offensive linemen in this draft. The Texans doing a ton of draft visits. I've been talking with guys in the office. There's some teams that have maybe like 7, 8, 9 draft visits. I think the Texans have had, close to 30 already. If it feels like they've met with a ton of prospects already, they're definitely doing their due diligence and making sure they're going to get the picks right in this draft. Now, coming up in just a moment, I have some very juicy draft buzz around the rest of the NFL that actually directly impacts your Houston Texans as we get closer and closer to draft day. But I want to know from you. I know this is the Texans channel. We're talking NFL draft. But before I tell you about our presenting sponsor, I want to hear from you. Do you believe the Rockets can make a run this year? Do you believe in H-Town, Clutch City? Give me a yes, give me a no. And if you're spamming your yes that you believe in the Rockets, well, why don't you go catch them during the NBA playoffs with our friends over at GameTime, the official ticketing partner of Texans today, and everybody here at Chat Sports. I love GameTime. You will too. The Rockets, they're red hot, the number 2 seed in the West. And if you ask me, probably the best team in the West right now, the hottest team in the West. And if you want to check out our Rockets in action live, go check it out on GameTime for the best deals on last-second tickets. You can even see your seat view before you buy the tickets in-app. The prices of those tickets usually get lower as the event gets closer. Easy access to your tickets from your phone. Easily resell your tickets. And like I said, you can see that seat view from the app. My other favorite feature in the GameTime app is they have a new feature called GameTime Picks that makes getting tickets to see your favorite teams play live even easier. GameTime Picks filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Download the GameTime app today, create an account, and use code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code CHATSPORTS for $20 off your first purchase. Download GameTime today. What time is it? It's game time. Now, let's get into some of the top NFL storylines. And a lot of this stuff I actually got from ESPN's Jeremy Fowler, who dropped a pretty nice article. It's on ESPN Plus, but that's why you subscribe here. If you don't have ESPN Plus, if you don't want to spend $120 a year like I do, hey, I break all those articles down for you here on Texans Today, 100% free. 3 running backs going in round 1. Let's break it down. Let's talk about it because I think it's a foregone conclusion that Ashton Jeanty, round 1 running back, right? A lot of people have him locked in already as a top 10 pick in this year's class. Another running back that a lot of people are talking about being a first rounder, Omarion Hampton, running back from North Carolina. He's getting a lot of round 1 buzz. Actually, producer Justin, he's a Cowboys fan. He actually said he wouldn't mind Omarion Hampton at 12 to the Dallas Cowboys. And if that happens, look, you have another, 17 picks in the first round? Maybe my math is off a little bit there. But you have a lot more picks in round 1 after the Cowboys. Who's to say another running back doesn't slide into round 1? Because a lot of these running backs, past Omarion Hampton, past Ashton Jeanty, are picking up a lot of action in the pre-draft process. Trevion Henderson is one of those running backs who a lot of people are talking about. Kaleb Johnson, who I just talked about meeting with the Texans. Quinshon Judkins as well. One of these guys could easily slip into the back end of round 1 because once there's a run on running backs, pun intended, I guess, you'll see a couple of them come off the board, and especially if 2 running backs go early, you could see a team at the end of round 1 say, hey, we don't know if we'll have a chance to get a starting running back later on in the draft, depending on where else they pick. So you could easily see, the Pittsburgh Steelers being one of those teams to draft a running back in round 1. I hate to say it, but maybe even your Houston Texans being one of those teams. And I hope the Texans aren't one of those teams that take a running back in round 1. I would hate for the Texans to be that third team, right? Because we just have other holes that we need to fill. We need other positions, and it's not like we can draft BPA. We can draft if there's an amazing player on the board. But to take a running back in round 1 when you definitely need starting offensive linemen, you need a wide receiver, and you could use some help on the defensive side in the depth perspective, taking a running back in round 1 seems a little rich for me, but the Texans are meeting with a ton of those guys so far, and there has been some buzz on running backs going a little bit earlier in this draft, especially with the blueprint that the Philadelphia Eagles laid out this past year with Saquon Barkley. Good offensive line, good running game, leads to some pretty good results as we saw from Philadelphia. Let's get into the next NFL storyline. Tyler Shough, could he be the 3rd quarterback off the board? Is he the 3rd QB behind Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders? People are talking. I will say, he's been getting a lot of interest from a lot of teams, and Tyler Shough, the numbers don't, bounce off the page, but funny enough, one of our draft guys here at Chat Sports, Jack Sperry, who is the host for our Steelers channel, he's actually a really big supporter of Tyler Shough, thinks he's going to be really good at the next level. This is what Jack Sperry had to say on Shough. Shough brings a good combination of physical traits, 6'5", 219 pounds, big talented arm, and plus athleticism, 4.65, 40-yard dash, with a good amount of in-structure playmaking polish. Touch and accuracy to all levels of the field, clean upper and lower body mechanics, mental processing and anticipation, with the ability to provide a little bit of out-of-the-structure playmaking ability as well. So obviously, there's a lot of people in the draft community that are starting to, prop up Tyler Shough as maybe that 3rd quarterback in this year's class. Adam Schefter had this one. Tyler Shough visited with the Browns on Monday and is visiting the Giants today. He also has scheduled to visit next week with the Raiders and Seahawks. Other previous visits include the Steelers, Jets, and Colts. So obviously, a lot of interest building up for Shough as we get closer and closer to the draft, visiting with the Browns, visiting with the Giants. And we talked about, earlier this week on the show, we talked about the possibility of a team trading back into round 1, a Browns, a Giants, one of those teams sitting at the beginning of round 2 if they want to jump up and grab a Tyler Shough, a Jalen Milroe, maybe even a Jackson Dart. That's seeming more and more possible as we get closer to the draft, because not only Tyler Shough visiting with all these teams, also Jackson Dart has visited with a lot of teams, along with Jalen Milroe, who has impressed teams like the Saints and the Browns. This is from Adam Schefter. Ole Miss quarterback Jackson Dart visited today with the Browns and will fly to Las Vegas to visit with the Raiders. Sources tell me Infield Yates. Dart has also spent considerable time during this interview process with the Giants, Saints, and Rams. And I want to note this out. In both of these tweets by Adam Schefter, do you know the one team that really sticks out to me and what you need to focus on for your Houston Texans? The Los Angeles Rams. Why is that? Because they pick after the Houston Texans in round 1. So if a team like the Giants, if a team like the Browns, the Raiders, if they want a quarterback and they feel like the Rams are going to target them in round 1 to be a successor to Matthew Stafford, maybe they trade up with the Houston Texans there at pick 25. We can trade back, get a ton of picks for trading back, and I think it's maybe a win-win scenario for all sides. Just something to keep your eye out on. These quarterbacks and the teams that they're meeting with, especially the LA Rams, maybe the Texans turn into a very hot trade piece on round 1 of the 2025 NFL Draft due to all these, third, fourth, fifth quarterbacks being interested in with some of these teams at the beginning of round 2. Let's talk about the last NFL storyline on today's show. Walter Nolen. Could he be this year's Jalen Carter? What are you talking about, Jeremy? Well, Jeremy Fowler was talking to a couple NFL executives and drew the comparison from Walter Nolen to Jalen Carter. This is what an NFL defensive coach had to say about Carter. Highest ceiling in the entire draft, and he's not just talking about defensive linemen. He's talking about all the players in this draft. Highest ceiling in the entire draft. Not as big as Carter, but has some of the same traits. And there's been a lot of discussion around Walter Nolen and kind of drawing the comparisons to Jalen Carter because he is an uber talented guy. I remember whenever he was coming out of high school being, recruited by top colleges, he was a hot commodity. Every top college in the nation wanted their hands on Walter Nolen, from Tennessee to Michigan to Texas A&M, where he ultimately ended up for the first 2 years of his collegiate career. Walter Nolen was one of the best players coming out of high school, and he still has a lot of those traits that made him a very promising prospect coming out of high school into college. And obviously the Texans, could they pick him at 25? I'm not sure if they reach on him if he does fall, because he does have some character concerns and other things that are pushing him down draft boards. But one thing's for sure, the Texans are interested in defensive line in this draft because they've met with multiple guys already. Nic Scourton, defensive lineman from Texas A&M. Shemar Stewart, Joshua Farmer, Kenneth Grant, Alfred Collins, TJ Sanders. They've met with a ton of guys in this draft class on the defensive line. And we can add another one because right before we started filming, Jordan Schultz dropped this. Ohio State defensive tackle Tyleik Williams has had a busy pre-draft process. Per sources, he's met with the Eagles, Bills, Texans, and Packers, with visits for the Lions, Ravens, and 49ers still ahead. Texans are busy, meeting with a ton of defensive linemen. And I truly do wonder, if Walter Nolen is there at 25, does DeMeco Ryans pull the trigger and say, hey, I know we have needs at other positions, but he's the best guy on our board by far. We got to take him. And I got to say, adding a premier defensive tackle to this defensive line just doesn't seem fair for opposing offensive lines, because you're telling me you're adding a premier DT. You have Danico Autry at that other defensive tackle, and then you have Daniil Hunter and William Henderson Jr. as your front four. Yeah, good luck to opposing teams. That would be a very interesting move by the Texans. You'd still have a couple of holes at, like I said, offensive line and wide receiver if you made that. But at the same time, I'd be interested in making our defensive line the best in the entire NFL. That's all I have for you on today's show. Make sure you hit that subscribe button for more Texans draft coverage. Like I said, next Wednesday, special pre-draft live with my man Aaron Wilson. If you want to check it out, make sure you hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications for the latest Texans news and rumors all year long.